Welcome in, welcome in. My name is just the Fabulous Nuts ASMR. My name is Paige, and tonight we are reading Edgar Allan Poe. We'll be reading some of his more Halloweeny, spooky things. So to get this evening's reading started, I'm going to go ahead and start with The Raven. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Let me get everything set up. Between poems, we will check the chat. So if I don't get right back to you, please give me a second and I shall check back with you as soon as I can. I'm sorry about how bright it has to be. Oh, I just lost my plug. We'll read until I have to get my plug off the floor. Alrighty. We are using the online library. Everything I am using, I promise, is in the public domain. I will have my links cited in the description when I'm finished. Sit back, close your eyes, and enjoy. Know that words and pronunciations and things I just can't pronounce, I'm going to change or skip over. So you might hear things that are a little bit different than you're used to, but that's okay. That's what makes it a little bit nutty. Here we go. The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if one gentle rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my door. Only this and nothing more." Oh, distinctly I remember it was bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from the books the creast of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden who the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, and certain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So that now, to still be beating of my heart, I stood there weeping, 'tis some visitor entreating entrance of my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This is this, and nothing more. Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, truly forgiveness I implore. But the fact I was napping, and you so gently came a-rapping, and so faintly you came a-tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarcely was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there and nothing more. Deep into the darkness peering, long I stood there, wandering, fearing, doubting, dreaming, dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore. This I whispered, and echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon I again heard tapping, something louder than before. "Surely," I said, "surely that's something at my window lattice. Let me see then what threat is, and the mysterious explore." Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more. Here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped the stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Alice, just above my chamber door, perched and sat with nothing more. Then the ebony bird beguiled my sad fancy into smiling, but the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, though the crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven? Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering in from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lord's name is the night's shore? Quote the raven, nevermore. Much as I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, through its answered little meaning, little reverency bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing birds above his chamber door, birds or beasts upon the sculptured bust above the chamber door, with such name as nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if its soul in the one word he did outpour, nothing further than he uttered, not a feather, then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, never more. Startled at the stillness broke my reply, so apt spoken. Doubtless, I said, what it utters, it is only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till this song's one burden bore, till the dirges of that hope, that melancholy burden bore of never, never more. But the raven still beguiling my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy into fancy, thinking that this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking never more. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllabus expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat dividing, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining, with the lamplight gloating o'er. But whose velvet violet lining, with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press, nevermore. Then methought it the air grew denser, perfume from the unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath spent thee, respite, and Nethapan, by the memories of Lauralan. Quaff this kind nepenteth, and forgot the lost Lenore, quoted the raven, never more. Desolate and yet undaunting, oh, the desert land enchanted, oh, the home by Homer's haunting, tell me truly, I implore, is the balm of gilded. Tell me, I implore, quoteth the raven, never more. Prophet, I said, thing of evil, prophet, still a bird of devil, by the heavens that bend above us, by the gods we both adore, tell this soul that sorrow laden within the distant Adian, it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels named Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden, who the angels named Lenore. Quoteth the raven, never more. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the plastered bust of Phallus just above my chamber door, and his eyes all above the seeming of the demons that are dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws the shadows on the floor. Oh, my soul from at the shadows that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So that was the raven. Thank you all for being here. Quiconic 135, thank you. We are doing some Poe reading tonight. Wanting everyone to go visit his channel. He said hi. He is living in Turkey. Welcome in, welcome in. He posted, let's see, who do we got? Simone is listening to us read Edgar Allan Poe tonight. We are using a public domain book. So we read one of the more popular ones. Thank you for being here, Simone. Thank you, Patrick. We read one of the more popular poems. So let's go back and pick another one for tonight. Let us see. What shall we read next? All right. So the next one, we can go ahead and read The Fall of the House of Usher. All right, we're opening it up. All right. Oh, I don't want to download the book. Hold on, guys. I am opening it up as PDF. I think I am downloading it. And there it is, PDF right there. So here we go. Edgar Allan Poe, The Fall of the House of Usher. He writes in multiple languages, so sans serait son nom suspendu, c'est que on lecture en rançon. So that's my French. Remember, if you can't understand me, that's because I don't speak French. During the whole of the dull, dark, and soundless day, in the autumn of the year when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singular dreary tract of country. And at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, with the view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of that building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirits. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half unpleasant, because of poetic sentiment with which had the mind unusually received even at the sternest natural images were terrible. I look upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank edges, and upon a few white trunks of decaying trees, with utter depression of the soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an ickiness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemable dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me? And the contemplation of the house of Usher. It was a mystery all insoluble. Nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. It was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while, beyond doubt, there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us. Still, the analysis of this power lies among consideration beyond our depth. It was possible, if reflected, that a mere different arrangement of peculiars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify or perhaps annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impressions. And, acting upon this idea, I reined in my horse to the precipitous brink of the black and lurid tarn that lay an unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down. Doo, doo, doo. But with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeling and inadvertent image of the gray sledge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant and eye-like windows. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now propose to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions and boyfriend elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had recently reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, in which wildly important nature had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The MS gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke of some acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best, and indeed his own personal friend, with the view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malaise. It was the manner in which all this and much more was said. It was a parent heart that went with this request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith what I still considered a very singular summons. Although as a boy we had never intimate association, yet I really knew little of my friend. He's reserved had been always excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that a very ancient family had been noted time out of mind for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself throughout long ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeating deeds of unobtrusive charity, as well as passionate devotion to intricacies, perhaps even more than the orthodox, of the easily recognizable beauties of the musical scene. I had learned too the very remarkable fact that of the usher race, all time honored as it was, had put forth at no period any endearing branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent and had always, with very trifling and very important variation, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered while running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which the one, in a long lapse of centuries, might have exercised upon the other. I'm trying to turn my brightness up. It was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issues and the constant and undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony from which the name which had at length so identified the two. Excuse me, I gotta adjust. As to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and irrevocable an irrevocable name of the House of Usher, which seemed to include, in the minds of the pleasantry who used it, both the family and the family mansion. I have said that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment of looking down with the top arm had been to deepen the first singular impression. There can be no doubt that the consciousness of the rapid increase of my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such I have long known as the paradoxal law of all sentiments having terror as a bias, and it might have been for this reason only that, when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself from the image of the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous indeed that I but mention it to show the valid force of the sensation which oppressed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe that above the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decaying trees and the grey wall, the silent tarn, and the pestilence of the mystic vapor, dullish, sluggish, faintly discernible, and laden hue, shaking off from my spirit must have been a dream. I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of its present principal features seem to have been that of an excessive and antiquity. The discoloration of age had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in fine, tangled webworks from the eaves. Yet all of this was apart from any extraordinarily dilapidation. No portion of the mansion had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect apertures of parts and the crumbling conditions of the individual stones. In this, there was much that reminded me of the spacious totality of old woodwork, which has rotted for years with some neglected vault, with no disturbance from the breath of the external air. Beyond this indication of the excessive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps eyes of scrutinizing observers might have discovered a barely messed up fissure which extended from the roof of the building in the front and made its way down the wall in a zigzagging. Oh, but let me reread that. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure which extended from the roof of the building in the front, made its way zigzagging direction till it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet of stealthy step thence conducted me in silence through many dark, intricate passages in my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiment of which I had already spoken, while the objects around me, while the carvings of the ceiling, the somber tapestries on the wall, the embodened blackness of the floors, and the immoral trophies which rattled as I strode, were but matters to which, or to such as which, I had been accustomed to from my infancies. While I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar all this, I wondered to find how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinate imagination were stirring up. One of the staircases I met a physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a maligning expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and at so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of indiscriminate light made their way through the trellised panes and served to render sufficiently distance the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung upon the wall. The general furnishing was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failing to give any validity to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow, an air of stern and deep and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from the sofa which he had been lying on full length and greeted me with a vicious warmth which had much in it. I at first thought of an overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of a man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down, and for some moments, while he spoke out, I gazed upon him with a feeling of half pity, half of awe. Surely, man had never been so terribly altered in so brief of a period as had Roderick Usher. It was difficult that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me, the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been all times remarkable. A cadaverous of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a suppressingly beautiful curve, a nose of delicate Hebrew model, but the breadth of the nostril unusual in similar formation, finely modeled chin, speaking in its want of prominence, excuse me, of a want of moral energy, air of a more than a web-like softness and tenitude. These features, with inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether not easily to be forgotten. And now, in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features and of the expressions that they were wont to convey, lay so much of change that I doubted to whom I spoke. Now, the now ghastly pallor of the skin, and the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things started and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as in its wild, gossamer texture it floated rather than fell about the face, it could not, even with effort, contain expression with the idea of simple humanity. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence of inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise of feeble and futile struggles to overcome an habitual trepidancy, an excessive nervous agitation. For something of this nature I had indeed been prepared, no less by his letter than by my reminiscences of certain boyish traits, and by conclusions deduced from this particular physical conformation and temperament. His action was altered vivaciously and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from tremulous indecision, when the animal spirits seemed utterly in abeyance, to that of species of energetic conclusions, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, hollow-sounding enunciation, that leaned, self-balanced, and perfectly guttural utterance, which may be observed in the lost drunkard or an irreclaimable eater of opium, during the periods of the most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. Of unnatural sensations. Some of these he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and the general manner of their narration of their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured even by faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds and these strange string instruments which did not inspire him with horror. To an anomalous species of terror, I found him abundant, abundant slave. I shall perish, he said. I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, not otherwise shall I be lost. I dread the event of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I have indeed no adherence with danger, except in its absolute effect in terror. In this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life with reason together in some struggle with the great phantom fear. I learned, moreover, at intervals and through broken and equivocal hints another singular feature of his mental condition. Mm. He was enchained by certain superstitions and impressions in regards to the dwelling which he tented, and whence for many years he had never ventured forth. In regards to an influence with superstitious force was conveyed in terms to shadow, here to be rested and influenced with some peculiarities in the mere form and substance of his family mansion. Had, but dint of long suffering, he said, obtained over his spirit an effect with the physique of the gray walls and turrets, of the dim tarn into which they all looked down, had at length brought upon them the moral of his existence. He admitted, however, all through his hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus affected him could be traced to more natural and far more palatable origins than to be severe and long causing illness. Indeed, the evident approaching dissolution of his beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative of earth. Her deceased, he said with bitterness, which I can never forget, would leave him hopeless and frail, the last of the ancient race of ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, so far as she was called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment and, without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I thought of her with utter astonishment, not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother, and he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more ordinary weariness had overspread his emaciated fingers, through which trickled many past. Hey, welcome, welcome. Too muted? You need me to talk a little louder? So, just to catch everybody up to speed, I'm not sure if you're understanding what's being read. I'm reading The Fall of the House of Usher, written by Edgar Allen Poe. And a lot of the wording that's being used is kind of old wording and old visuals. What has happened up to this point is he has asked for a friend of his, Usher, had written him a letter and summoned him to his old family home. He got to the home to find it looks like decrepit and falling down, but yet it still stands and looks sturdy, almost like a piece of wood, he said, that was rotted from the inside out, but still looked sturdy on the inside. And he went in and he finds his friend that has many different medical conditions going on. From his taste, all of his senses are affected by a family curse. And his only companion who was in this house that's falling apart is the sister, um, who is still living. So this gentleman that he went to visit is not doing well. Okay. So we shall get back into the story with the whispering to relax. So a lot of the words and phrasing are older words, if you're not catching them. But it's just written beautifully. Okay. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physician, and settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and frequent, although transient, affections of a peculiar character were the unusual diagnosis. Hitherto she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady, and had not betaken herself to her final bed. But on the closing in the evening of my arrival at the house, she succumbed. As her brother told me that night with inexpressible agitation. Her brother had already foretold. Okay, great, 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 great. Okay. My grandmother used to read this Poe to us when we were little, and she read it to her kids too. All right, so the brother died. To the prostrating power of the destroyer, and I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would be the last I should obtain, that the lady, at last, while living, would be seen no more. For several days ensuing, her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself. During this period, I was busy in earnest endeavorments to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. And read together, or I listened as if in a dream to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar, and thus, as a closer and still closer intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly did did I perceive the fertility of all attempts at sharing a mind from which darkness, as if an inherent positive quality, pulled forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall ever bear about me the memory of many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the house of Usher. Yet I should fail in any attempts to convey an idea of exact character of the studies or of the occupations in which he involved me or led me the way. An excited and highly distempered ideal threw a sulphurous luster over all. His long, improvised dirges would ring forever in my ears. Among other things, I hold painful a mind of certain singular perversions of and amplifications of wild airs of the last waltz of von Weber. From the painting which over his elaborate fancy brooded, and which grew touch by touch into vagueness, at which I shuddered at the mere thrilling, because I shuddered knowing not why. From these paintings, vivid in their image, just now are before me, I would in vain endeavor to deduce more than a small portion which should lie upon the compass of merely written words, but the utter simplicity, by the nakedness of his designs, he arrested the overall attention. If ever moral painting an idea, that mortal was Roderick Usher. For me at least, in the circumstances then surrounding me, there arose out of the pure abstraction which the hypochondriac contrived to throw open his canvas, an intensity of intolerable awe, no shadow of which felt I ever yet in contemplation of the certainty glowing yet to concrete revelries of Felice. One of the one of the more fantastical concepts of my friend, partaking not so rigid of the spirit of abstraction, may be shadowed forth, although feebly in words. A small picturesque picture presented the interior of an immense, long, and rectangular vault or tunnel. The low walls, smooth, white, and without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea of its excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed in any portion of its vast extent, and no torch or other artificial source of light was discernible. Yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. I have just spoken of that morbid condition of auditory nerve which rendered all the music intolerable to the sufferer, with the exception of certain effects of strained instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined upon the guitar which gave birth to greater measure to the fantastic character of his performance. But the fevered facility of his impromptuness could not be so accounted for. They must have been and were in the notes, as well as the words of his wild fantasies, for not has he unfrequently accompanied himself with rimmed verbal improvisations. The result of that intense mental collectedness and concentration to which I have previously alluded, as observed only in particular moments of highest artificial excitement. The word of one of these rhapsodies I have easily remembered. I was perhaps the more forcibly impressed with it as he gave it because, in the utter mystic current of its meaning, I fancied that perceived, and for the first time, a full consciousness of the part of Usher. Uttering of his lofty reasons upon her throne. The verses, which were entitled The Haunted Palace, ran very nearly, if not accurately, thus. In the greenest of our valleys be good angels tented, once fair and stately place, radiant place, reared its head, in the monarch's thoughts domain. It stood there, a seraphim spread a pinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on their roof did float and flow. All this was the Odeon pine, an ever gentle air that dallied in that sweet day along the ramparts plumbed and piled, and wiggled odor went away. Wagoners at the happy valley through the two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne were sitting, in state of his glory, well befitting. The ruler of the realm was seen. Part 4, verse 4. And all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair parlor door, through which came flowing, 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 the sparkling evermore, and the troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, and the voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things in robes of sorrow assault the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate, and round about his home the glory that busted and is but a dim remembered story of old times entombed. And the travelers now within the valley, through the red littered windows see vast forms of moving fantastically to the discord melody, while like the rapid ghastly river through the pale door, a hideous throng rush out forever, and laugh but smile no more. I well remember that suggestion arising from his ballad led us to a train of thought wherein there becomes manifest an opinion of Usher, which I mention not so much on account of its novelty, for other men too have thought thus, as an account of its peculiarity which he maintained it. The opinion in its general form was that the sentence of all the vegetable things, but in his disordered fancy, the idea had consumed a more daring character and trespassed with certain conditions upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack words to express the full extent or the earnest abandonment of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I now previously hinted, with the grey stones of the home of his forefathers. The condition of the sentence had been here. He imagined fulfilled in the method of collecting these stones, in the order of their arrangement, as well as the many fungi which overspread them, and of the decaying trees which stood around. Above all, in the long undisturbed insurance of this arrangement, and in of the tarn, it's evident, the evidence of the sentence. He said, and I started as he spoke, in a gradual yet certain condensation of the atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in a silent yet in multitude and terrible influence for which centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him, for what I now saw him, what he was. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. Welcome in, welcome in. Thank you. We are reading The Fall of the House of Usher. Yeah, it's the way he wrote this is very odd because there's a flow and it just flows. There's no pauses, no like real paragraphs. It's very flowy. Let me get a sip and we will get back in to our story with Edgar Allan Poe. Huh? Thank you. Yes, 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 we are being scary. Okay, here we go. Ready? Our books, the books which, for years had formed no small portion of the mental existence of the invalid, were, as might be supported, in strict keeping with the character of phantasma. We pore together over such works as Verte et Chartreuse, or The Great of Gresser, Machiavelli, uh, Belfgor, sorry about that, Heaven and Hell, The Swedenborg, The Voyage of Nicholas Klim by Holberg, The Chromacy of Robert Foote, Jean somebody, and The Journey, let's see, The Journey into the Blue Distance, Tetch, the City of the Sun. Our favorite volume was one small octavo edition of the Directum Inquisitium by Dominican whatever, and Pompous Melee about old, oh, here you go. And there were passages in the Pompous Melee about the old African satyrs and the Egyptians, over which Usher would sit dreaming for hours. His chief delight, however, was found in the perusal of the exceedingly rare and curious books in the Quarto Gothic, the Manual of a Forgotten Church of Filigre Morum, something something in Latin, Sanctium Corium Ecclesi. Okay, let me try to say it. Filingi Mortium Sanctium Pluri Ecclesic Magnetine. I could not help thinking of the wild ritual of this work and of the portable influence upon the hypochondriac. When one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated of his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight previously to its final interment in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The worldly The reason, however, assigned for this singular proceeding was one which I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to this resolution, so he told me, by consideration of the usual character of the deceased, of certain obtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of her medical men, and of the remote and exposed situation of the burial grounds of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person whom I met upon the staircase on the day of the arrival of the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded as at best but a harmless and by no means unnatural precaution. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for the temporary entombment. The body having been encoffed, we two alone or its rest. The vault in which we placed it, which had been long ago unopened, which had been so long unopened that our torches half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation. It was small and damp, and entirely without means of emitting any light, laying at great depths immediate to the building in which was my own sleeping apartment. It had been used apparently in remote feudal times for the worst purpose of a donjon keep, and in later days as a place of deposit for powder or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor and holes into which we reached it were carefully sheathed with copper. The door, welcome in, welcome in. We are reading The Fall of the House of Usher. So the sister has died, and now they're setting up her tomb, and it's always inside this old castle. So it's like the House of Usher is like built like an old castle. Okay. The door of massive iron had been so similarly protected, its immense weight caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden upon trestles within the region of horror, we particularly turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between the brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned that must that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the deceased, for we could not regard her unwed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady and the maturity of youth had left, and as usual in all sickness of strict character, the mockery of the faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip which is so terrible in the deceased. We were placed and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door of iron, made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartment of the upper portion of the house. And now, some days of bitter grief having ellipsed. An uh, obs- observable change came over the features of the mental order of my friend. His ordinary manner vanished. His ordinary accompani- accompaniments were neglected or forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal, and objectless steps. The pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the illumination of his eyes had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskiness of his tone was heard no more, and the tremulous quaver, as if of an extremely terrible habitual characterized of his utterance. There were times, indeed, when I thought of his incessantly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. At time again, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicity, vulgarity, and explicit vagaries of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours in the attitude of professional of the profound attendance, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It was a wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me by slow yet certain degrees the wild influence of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was especially upon re-entering the bed late in the night of the seventh or eighth day after placing the Lady Madeline within the donjon, donjon, Donjon. That's not how we spell it nowadays. Donjon, that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch while the hours waned and waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominated over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all, of what I felt was due to the bewildering influence of the gloomy future of the furniture of the room, of the dark and tattered draperies which tortured into motion by breath of the rising tempest, swaying fitfully to and fro upon the walls and rustling uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless, and an irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my heart an incubus of utter causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a grasp and a struggle, I lifted myself upon the pillows and peered earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber. Hearkened, I know not why, except that an instinctive spirit prompted me to certain low and indefinable sounds, indefinite sounds, which came, through the pause in the storm of long intervals, I knew not whence, overpowered by the intense sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet unendurable, I threw on my clothes with haste, for I felt that I should sleep no more during the night, and endeavored to arouse myself from the pitiful condition into which I had fallen by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment. I had taken but a few turns in this manner when a light step on the adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. In an instant afterwards he rapped with a gentle touch at my door and entered bearing the lamp. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, but moreover there was a species of mad hilarity